It was last winter when I decided to take my dog Roscoe for a solo camping trip deep into the state forest. I drove for nearly an hour up a narrow, unmaintained trail that was slick with packed ice and snow. There were no other tire tracks in sight, which was exactly the kind of isolation I was looking for. After parking at a small pull-off, I hiked 20 minutes into a clearing, surrounded by thick, silent trees. The snow was deep and completely untouched, confirming that no one had been here for a long time. I set to work pitching my tent and staking it down hard into the frozen ground. Roscoe wandered nearby, sniffing the air and occasionally jumping through the snow in excitement. Knowing the temperature would drop well below freezing, I layered up with thermals and a heavy jacket. I gathered some dead wood and built a small fire to cook a simple dinner. The woods were unnervingly quiet, as if the heavy snow was absorbing every possible sound. Suddenly, Roscoe stood up and began barking aggressively toward a dark patch of trees. I told him to relax, assuming he had just spotted a deer passing through the brush. I checked the handgun holstered at my side, a precaution I always take when camping alone. 20 minutes later, the barking returned, but this time it was louder and more frantic. Then I heard it too, the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the frozen snow. I stood up and peered into the darkness, my heart starting to race. Roscoe went from growling to a haunting silence, his eyes locked on a single spot. A shape emerged at the edge of the tree line, a man standing half hidden in the shadows. I called out to him, my voice shaking as I told him he had scared me. The figure stepped forward just enough for the fire to catch his face, and his expression was far from friendly. He asked what I was doing so deep in the woods, his tone dripping with a strange aggression. I tried to stay calm and explained I was just out here with my dog to enjoy nature. He didn't respond, he just stood there watching me with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Sensing the situation was turning dangerous, I firmly told him that I was armed. The man let out a small, chilling laugh and asked where my hospitality was before disappearing back into the dark. I stood frozen for a long time, listening to his footsteps fade into the silence of the trees. Even though he was gone, the air felt different, charged with a sense of being watched. I quickly put out the fire, burying the embers in snow so no light would give away my position. I crawled into the tent with Roscoe and zipped it tight, my heart pounding against my ribs. I tried to stay warm, but the cold from the frozen ground seemed to seep through my sleeping pad. Hours passed in agonizing silence until Roscoe started growling again, a low vibration in his chest. Footsteps in the snow returned, moving slowly and deliberately toward the tent. They stopped right outside the thin fabric, and I could hear the shift of weight in the snow. Roscoe began to howl, a sound of pure distress that echoed through the empty woods. I pulled my gun and cocked it, shouting that I would shoot if they didn't leave immediately. There was a long silence, then the footsteps began to move away, faster this time. I didn't dare look out. I stayed frozen in that tent for the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn finally appeared, I packed my gear in a frantic blur. We hiked back to the truck, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from those woods. I never went back to that part of the forest, and I never will again. The memory of that frozen forest still sends a shiver down my spine whenever the wind howls at night. It began on the second afternoon of my trip when the sun started its early descent behind the skeletal trees. Roscoe suddenly stopped in his tracks, his hackles rising like a row of stiff needles along his back. I looked ahead and noticed a man standing perfectly still about 50 yards down the trail. He wore an oversized, filthy wool coat that hung off his gaunt frame like a shroud. There was no backpack, no gear, and no winter supplies visible on his person. I raised a hand in a hesitant wave, but the figure didn't move an inch in response. Roscoe let out a low, vibrating growl that I felt in the soles of my boots. Suddenly, the man turned sharply and vanished into the thick undergrowth without making a sound. A heavy silence descended over the woods, making the sound of my own breathing seem deafening. I decided to head back to my campsite immediately, keeping a tight grip on Roscoe's lead. Every snap of a twig behind us felt like a footstep closing the distance. When I finally saw the orange glow of my dying campfire, I felt a brief surge of safety. I spent the next 20 minutes gathering extra wood and fortifying the perimeter of my camp. Inside the tent, I checked my hunting knife and kept it within arm's reach of my sleeping bag. Hours passed as I lay there, staring at the shadows dancing on the thin nylon walls. Around 2 a.m., the forest went completely silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath. That was when I heard it, the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen snow right outside the tent flap. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as the footsteps stopped. A long, thin shadow stretched across the side of the tent, indicating someone was standing just inches away. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shouting as loudly as I could to ward off the intruder. There was no running, no scuffling, only the sound of the wind picking up through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the clearing was empty. But right where the shadow had been, a single perfectly formed circle of stones had been laid on the snow. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting with my back against the center pole and Roscoe at my feet. As dawn broke, I packed my gear with trembling hands, not even stopping to make coffee. I felt eyes on me from the tree line the entire time I worked. Just as I was about to leave, I found a small scrap of wool snagged on a branch near my tent. It was the same material as the coat the man on the trail had been wearing. I hiked out of that forest at a pace that left me gasping for air. Reaching the parking lot felt like crossing back into the world of the living. I drove home in silence, trying to rationalize what I had seen and heard. However, the feeling of being watched didn't fade once I reached the city limits. A few months later, I traveled to Charleston with some friends to clear my head. The warm southern air and the sound of jazz from the bars helped me finally relax. But as we turned a corner onto a quiet residential block, I saw him again. It wasn't the man from the woods, but someone equally wrong for the setting. He was shambling with a bizarre, jerky gait that didn't look human. My friends saw him too, their laughter dying instantly as they took in his appearance. We hurried past, but when I looked back, the street was completely empty. Later that night, while the others slept, I heard a rhythmic tapping on my second-story hotel window. I pulled back the curtain to find a pale hand pressed against the glass, though there was no balcony outside. The sweltering July heat of 2025 hung heavy over the cobblestone streets of Charleston as I arrived to visit my old friend Mark. We spent the first afternoon catching up over a game of pickleball, enjoying the rare chance to reconnect after years apart. Mark was staying in a tall, narrow house in the heart of the city, and I settled onto the downstairs couch for the night. Through the window, I could see a labyrinth of dark alleyways and the skeletal frame of an abandoned house across the street. The next morning was bright and busy, so we decided to explore the famous Charleston market. After browsing the stalls, we wandered out toward the docks where the salty air blew off the water. That was when we first saw him, a figure that immediately felt entirely out of place. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked perfectly pressed, complete with a crisp black bow tie. His long black curly hair bounced slightly as he moved with a slow, detached, shambling gait. He didn't seem to notice the noise of the market or the people around him, lost in his own bizarre world. I felt an instinctive urge to stay away from him, so I grabbed Mark's arm to prevent us from crossing his path. We turned right instead, walking quickly to put several blocks of distance between us and the man in the suit. I remarked to Mark that the man didn't look homeless at all because his clothes were too clean and sharp. We kept walking for about 15 minutes, making several turns into a completely different district of the city. Suddenly, I looked toward a small boutique shop and saw that same shambling figure diagonal to us. There was no logical way he could have reached that spot before us while moving so slowly. We both stared for a long moment, but he never looked back, just continued his rhythmic, broken pace. We tried to push the encounter out of our minds as we prepared for the July 4th celebrations. That evening, we drove out to an island 20 minutes away to watch the fireworks display. For a while, the man in the suit was forgotten amidst the loud booms and bright lights of the holiday. However, deep down, a sense of wrongness still lingered like a cold draft in the summer air. The following night, July 5th, we decided to attend a historical ghost tour through the city's older sections. The city was absolutely packed with tourists, and the main thoroughfares were swarming with people. As we finished the tour and walked back toward the car, a massive wave of people began moving toward us. Right in the middle of that fast-moving crowd, we both saw him again at the exact same moment. He was still wearing the same pristine wedding suit and bow tie, shambling as if he were a puppet on loose strings. Most unsettling was how the people around him seemed completely oblivious to his presence. For a brief, terrifying second, his eyes met mine before he continued his slow journey forward. He seemed tied to the movement of the crowd, yet entirely separate from the reality of it. We watched him until the crowd thinned, seeing him turn into a dark, narrow side street. Neither of us spoke as we walked back to Mark's house, the weight of the repeated sightings pressing down on us. Mark headed upstairs to his bedroom while I prepared my spot on the downstairs couch once more. I made sure to pull the blinds tightly shut, feeling an irrational fear of the windows facing the alley. Sleep finally took me, though it was a restless, shallow kind of rest filled with strange dreams. I snapped awake in the dead of night to a distinct, rhythmic tapping on the glass right behind my head. I froze for several minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs as I waited for the sound to repeat. Finally, I forced myself to lift the edge of the blind just enough to peer down into the alleyway. Far down the alley, under a flickering light, I saw the back of the man in the wedding suit. Just before he rounded the corner, he stopped and slowly turned his head to look directly back at the house. He disappeared from view, leaving me shaking in the dark, wondering if he was even human at all. As I turned away from the window, I noticed a small, wet smudge on the inside of the glass that hadn't been there before. I turned away from the window, but the sight of that small, wet smudge on the inside of the glass made my skin crawl. The next day was the 4th of July, and the city of Charleston was vibrating with the energy of thousands of tourists. Mark and I tried to push the memory of the shambling man out of our minds as we prepared for the evening festivities. We spent the night on an island about 20 minutes away, watching the fireworks burst over the water in brilliant displays of light. Despite the beauty of the show, a lingering sense of being watched refused to leave the back of my mind. On the night of July 5th, we decided to attend a ghost tour through the historical district. The tour concluded in a heavily populated area near a cluster of popular restaurants and bars. A massive wave of people began moving toward us, walking quickly to reach their next destination. Right in the center of that fast-moving crowd, I saw a figure that didn't belong. It was him again, the man in the wedding suit, his black curly hair reflecting the overhead streetlights. He was shambling at that same slow, agonizing pace while everyone else surged around him like a river around a stone. Most bizarrely, the people walking inches away from him didn't seem to notice his presence at all. For one brief, terrifying second, his eyes locked onto mine as he drifted through the sea of bodies. He didn't stop or speak, he simply continued his mechanical, dragging walk toward the darker end of the street. Mark and I stood frozen in place, watching him until the crowd finally thinned out enough for us to see him turn a corner. We were both silent, unable to reconcile how he could keep appearing in different parts of the city at exactly the right time. We finally returned to Mark's house, and the silence of the residential neighborhood felt heavy and threatening. Mark headed upstairs to his room, and I prepared to spend my final night on the downstairs couch. I made sure to pull the blinds completely shut, leaving only a tiny sliver of a gap at the very bottom. I lay there in the dark, listening to the house creak and the distant sound of city traffic. In the middle of the night, a sharp, rhythmic sound shattered the silence of the room. Someone was tapping on the glass of the window right next to where my head was resting. I froze for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I finally forced myself to sit up and peek through the small opening I had left in the blinds. I looked down the long, narrow alleyway that ran along the side of the apartment building. At the very end of the alley, I saw the familiar silhouette of the man in the wedding suit. He was walking away from the house, his body tilting and swaying in that rhythmic, shambling motion. Just before he disappeared around the corner of the building, he stopped and turned his head back toward the window. He stared directly at the spot where I was hiding, as if he could see through the blinds and into my soul. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting in the dark with my back against the couch, waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, I told Mark everything that had happened during the night. Mark, who usually dismissed anything that wasn't grounded in logic, looked visibly shaken by my description of the tapping. He admitted that he had heard a similar dragging sound in the hallway outside his room the night before. I drove home to Florida that day, but the image of the man in the suit wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him shambling through the crowd, untouched and unnoticed by the world. I wondered if he was even a man at all, or something far more ancient and sinister wearing a human disguise. Weeks passed, and the fear began to fade into a dull, nagging memory of a strange weekend. But then, a few months later, I received a frantic text from Mark that brought all the terror rushing back. He sent me a photo he had taken of a local newspaper article about an abandoned house across from his apartment. In the background of the newspaper photo, visible in the second-story window of the abandoned house, was the unmistakable white bow tie of the shambling man. I moved into my first house thinking it would be my ultimate sanctuary from the world. Life followed a very strict and predictable pattern every single day. It started with the front door deadbolt feeling just a little bit loose. I remember clearly locking it before I went to bed the night before. I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on a tired mind. 2 days later, I found my landline phone unplugged from the wall socket. I never used that phone, but I certainly never touched the cord. A week passed without incident until I walked into the kitchen for a midnight snack. Every single cabinet door was standing wide open in the darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly closed them one by one. I began checking the windows every hour on the hour. Nothing was ever stolen, which somehow made the situation feel much worse. I noticed that the thermostat had been turned down to 60 degrees while I was out. The house felt icy and unwelcoming when I stepped through the door. My toothbrush was damp in the morning even though I hadn't used it yet. I stared at it for several minutes, feeling a sick sensation in my stomach. I balanced a penny on top of the basement door handle. Every morning for a week, the traps remained perfectly undisturbed. I began to wonder if I was developing some kind of early onset dementia. I searched the entire house for hidden cameras or signs of forced entry. The attic was empty and the windows were all bolted tight from the inside. That night, I heard a very faint scratching sound coming from the walls. I told myself it was just mice or the house settling in the cold. Suddenly, the scratching stopped and was replaced by a rhythmic thumping. It sounded exactly like a human heart beating right behind the plaster. I didn't sleep a single second for the rest of that night. In the morning, I found a strange smudge on the basement door handle. The penny I had balanced there was gone entirely. I searched the floor, but the coin had vanished into thin air. I felt a cold draft blowing out from the gap beneath the basement door. I reached for the handle, but my hand stopped just inches away. A heavy, metallic smell drifted through the air from the other side. I decided to leave the house and spend the day at a crowded library. Even there, I felt like every person passing by was watching me. When I returned home, I found my front door was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact that I had locked it with both the handle and the deadbolt. I stepped inside the house and heard the sound of heavy breathing from the top of the stairs. A single muddy footprint was visible on the bottom step of the staircase. As I reached for my phone to call for help, I realized the line had been cut from the outside. I stood paralyzed in the kitchen, clutching the knife as the silence of the house felt heavy and suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet of the early morning. My eyes drifted toward the basement door, which I was certain I had closed before sitting down. A thin sliver of absolute darkness beckoned from the gap where the door stood cracked open. I remembered the muddy footprints from earlier and realized the intruder hadn't left. They had simply descended. I forced my legs to move, each step toward the hallway, feeling like I was wading through deep water. I kept my back against the wall, terrified that someone would reach out from the shadows behind me. The cold air rising from the basement felt like a physical warning as I approached the threshold. I reached out a trembling hand toward the wood of the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to open it, but the need to know what was lurking beneath my feet was overwhelming. A faint, rhythmic scratching sound drifted up from the bottom of the stairs. I leaned in closer, my eye pressed to the crack, trying to make sense of the shapes below. At the very bottom of the steps, a figure stood perfectly still, draped in heavy shadows. The person was barefoot, their toes gripping the cold concrete in a way that looked primal and wrong. I realized they were looking straight up at me, their face lost in the void of the unlit room. Instinct took over, and I slammed the door shut with all the strength I had left. I didn't stop to lock it, I just turned and sprinted toward the front of the house. I fumbled with the deadbolt on the front door, my fingers feeling like lead weights. I burst out into the night air, the cold wind hitting my face as I raced toward my car. I scrambled into the driver's seat and locked the car doors, my chest heaving with exertion. Through the windshield, I stared at the silent house, wondering if the front door would open again. I grabbed my phone from the center console and dialed emergency services for the second time that week. I told the dispatcher that someone was definitely in my basement and I was trapped outside in my vehicle. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the blue and red lights to appear on my quiet street. Finally, the flicker of sirens began to dance against the trees at the end of the block. 2 police cruisers pulled up, their engines rumbling as officers stepped out with flashlights drawn. I stayed in the car, watching through the glass as they approached the front door with practiced caution. The officers entered the house, their beams of light sweeping through the windows of my living room. I waited in the silence of the car, the only sound being the static from the police radio nearby. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers emerged from the house leading a man in handcuffs. He was wearing dark, filthy clothes that looked like they had been lived in for weeks. The man's expression was blank, devoid of any remorse or even awareness that he had been caught. One officer came over to my car and signaled for me to roll down the window. He told me they found a small living space set up behind the furnace in the corner of the basement. There were empty food wrappers from my own kitchen and several of my water bottles scattered around his nest. Most disturbing of all was a phone charger plugged into a nearby outlet, neatly coiled and ready for use. I realized he had been watching my schedule, knowing exactly when I went to the gym to come up and feed himself. After giving my statement, I walked back into my house, but it no longer felt like home. I sat on my bed, unable to sleep, scrolling through my phone to distract my racing mind. That's when I saw a new photo in my gallery, a picture of me asleep in this very bed, taken from the foot of the mattress while the intruder stood over me. I sprinted out of the house and dove into my car, locking the doors with trembling fingers. My breath came in ragged gasps as I dialed 911 for the second time that night. Within minutes, the quiet street was flooded with the rhythmic strobing of red and blue police lights. I watched from the safety of a patrol car as officers drew their weapons and entered through my front door. A few minutes later, they emerged from the house leading a man in handcuffs. The intruder was barefoot, wearing dark, grimy clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He didn't look at me once, his expression vacant and hollow as they put him in the back of another car. I sat there shaking, my voice stuttering as I tried to answer the officer's questions. An officer finally came out and asked me exactly how long I had lived in the house. He asked about my gym schedule, confirming the intruder had been tracking my every move. They found food wrappers and bottled water hidden in the crawl space behind the furnace. There was even a phone charger plugged into a nearby outlet that I had never noticed before. The man had been sleeping on the cold concrete, using old, itchy insulation as a makeshift bed. The officer explained the likely charges, but his words felt like they were coming from miles away. Walking back into my own home felt like entering a tomb where a ghost still lingered. I spent the next few days in a daze, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. A week later, I was scrolling through my camera roll to find a photo for a friend. I stopped when I saw a thumbnail that didn't look familiar. I tapped the image and my heart physically stopped when it expanded to full screen. It was a photo of me, sound asleep in my bed, taken from the foot of the mattress. The timestamp on the photo was 3:11 a.m., the very night my phone had been unplugged. I realized with a jolt of terror that the intruder had stood over me for minutes while I was vulnerable. I immediately contacted the detective listed on my incident report to report the new evidence. I drove to the station to digitally transfer the photo to their supplemental evidence file. The detective told me that this photo would upgrade the charges to felony stalking. He explained that the man would likely be registered as a sex offender for the rest of his life. While that was good to hear, the knowledge didn't stop the nightmares from coming every night. I can't look at the basement door now without seeing that dark outline on the stairs. I ended up selling the house and moving into a high-security apartment on the 10th floor. Even now, I check my locks 3 times before I can even think about closing my eyes. Every time my phone charger slips out of the wall, a cold wave of panic washes over me. The sense of safety I once had in my own home is gone forever. I often wonder if there are other spaces in houses, voids behind walls or beneath floors where people hide. This experience taught me that the most disturbing monsters aren't ghosts or demons. They are ordinary people who decide to step into your life without your permission. I will never again ignore a loose lock or a strange thump in the night. Sometimes I wake up and check my camera roll first thing, just to make sure no new photos appeared. The intruder's in prison now, but the version of me that felt safe died that night in the basement. Please, always listen to your gut, because the silence in your house might not be as empty as it seems. Sleep well, and make sure your doors are truly locked.